I just want to thank the organizers again for having us back. It's a lot of fun to come. For those of you who have seen this before, the first few slides may be slightly repetitive, but basically what we've done is we've built a mechatronic hybrid robot. It's about the size of a dowry box, a bit smaller than this table, 1 meter by 70 by 70, which has a metal structure and then acrylic arms and a latex sheet over the top. And this hides a grid of 32 sensors and servos, which allow you to act on the surface and interact with the surface. It also allows the surface to represent images of sound impressed upwards. And one of the things we've been working on recently is now incorporating a lighting structure into it so that we have 2.5 dimensions of motion as well as lights. The impetus for this project started about a little over a year ago. We were approached by the artist Matthew Herbert to work in collaboration to produce a device. He wasn't entirely clear what it was going to turn into. We had no idea at the time. But it was a device which he would implicitly be able to train. There's an image up there of him initially practicing deforming the space in which we were going to try and define all of these sounds. In subsequent iterations, it became a visualizer in the lower corner, and in a final iteration of that process, it was part of an opera that he was commissioned to do at the Royal Opera House last April, I guess it was. So what we're going to talk to you a little bit about today is how we're taking this sense of the device as a visualizer and moving with it forward. Obviously, in historical music representation, audio representation domains, you have an oscilloscope trace. You have 2 dimensions, a 2-dimensional plane, and on that plane you can represent amplitude and time. With spectrographic representations, you gain color as a 3rd dimension, but it's still represented in a 2-dimensional plane. And the original 2 dimensions, X and Y, you then get time and, of course, frequency. What we're trying to do with this 2.5D sort of haptic interface is to say, look, let's say you have X and Y and a half dimension of Z. And additionally to that, you can still inform colors onto the surface. Well, what that basically means is that now we can describe one more dimension or some additional facet of the audio in a way that's immediately interpretable as a visual signal and in a way that you can actually manipulate as a performer. What we have here are a couple of different visual representations of the space in which we're working. These are mappings into a timbre space. So instead of just looking at pitch and time and using those as control features for sound synthesis and sound visualization, we're now looking at ways in which you can augment this relatively prosaic information structure with stuff that normally falls outside the domain of visualization. There is some prior work in visualization of timbre. Craig Sapp at Karma worked a lot with tristimuli about 10 years ago. Kai Sederberg at CNMAT in Berkeley has come up with a number of interesting visualizations, but they all rely on the fact that they're visualizations on a 2-dimensional screen. By taking this out of the 2D space, we're basically giving the performer who's interacting with this surface an additional visual source of timbral feedback from the device. And with this, in the interaction in the course of a performance, the haptic control on the visualized timbral elements allows you to actually feel the feedback of the tone that you're creating in the form of synthesis. This completely subverts traditional performance models on electronic instruments, where there's very rarely any sort of haptic feedback about the timbre space that you're moving through. Leo's going to talk a little bit more about this now.
Okay, so if we go back to why the device was called the Mephistophone, we were talking about Matthew Herbert, who commissioned the first prototype of this thing that then sort of became its own thing. And that was for a performance of his reinterpretation of the Faustian myth at the Royal Opera House. So he wrote an opera where basically Mephistopheles, the devil in the Faustian legend, is a robot or an electronic something, an artificial agent. And this is Tartini. This is one of the famous, Tartini, Robert Johnson, Paganini. They've all been accused of selling their soul to the devil. What does that actually mean as a cultural phenomenon? Well, what if it's to do with a musical agency, some higher level of musical agency, that a musician either fantasizes about him for himself or likes to externalize, for instance, in an instrument. And what we see actually is a number of ethnomusicological examples of this. So this is the Biludi vibraphones from Congo, which are huge wooden and metal structures, that obviously anthropomorphized there. And these are the Ngombe from Gabon. You can see very clearly the anthropomorphic elements. But the interesting thing here is that these strings on the harps represent an umbilical cord between the spiritual world, in this case the dead, and the real world. So what does this have to do with our rhetoric, with our discourse of interactivity? Well, a lot of the last couple of decades at work that's done at places like Earcam and Steim have revolved around the main paradigm that we're going to move away from reactive musical interactivity to interactive musical interactivity. And I think it was alluded to a couple of talks ago that we were going to go from generative to transformative music, that the machine as a tool was going to go into the machine as an instrument, and that, you know, basically it's going to get self-conscious and going to start performing, co-creating instead of just responding to our actions. And well, we were wondering, what if that's already sort of happening? So this is a timbral space of a violin, right? What you see up there on the top left is called a Schelling diagram made by a famous Norwegian double bass player. And you can basically see that in some, this is just a very reductionist two-dimensional model of timbre, you get different regimes that people are sometimes requested to play in different areas of this timbral space. And there's some sense of a space of co-agency there between a musician, a performer who's trying to manipulate a path through this timbral space in one direction, and maybe an instrument who's trying to resist that, who's trying to lead him into another space of possibilities. And the idea of resistance, of the instrument's resistance and of the instrument's agency sort of comes in here. So the anthropomorphization almost comes across as the musician fantasizes an agency which doesn't really exist for the instrument itself. So we have these spaces of co-agency, and these are then electronic models that we've made through machine learning models of violin performance data. And this idea of the space of co-agency becomes quite important. So what we do is we take a caricature of this model, or indeed of these models of musical interactivity, by saying we're going to physicalize this space of co-agency. So instead of just being abstract timbral space, we say it's physically here. It's the size of this table, and we're going to manipulate and see it, and it's going to be intricately linked to, or intrinsically, sorry, linked to the sound that we're going to make out of this thing. So previous oppositional systems, for instance, Nick Collins's work, NIME, I think 3 years ago, worked on the basis that you have the agency of the instrument. The base case for that agency is basically to fight against the musician, right? So you work out what the musician's trying to do, and then you try and oppose that. And that's mainly been done on an abstract level. It's mainly been done in software, in computers, so you try and work out what he's going to do, and you play something that sounds a bit wrong. What we're trying to do is make it ergonomically relevant, so that you're really fighting this machine. And then you can begin to caricature and explore, I think, the 3 main paradigms at that point of musical interactivity. You make really a piss take of all of them. The first one is as this imaginary subject, so that you're imagining the fake agency of this thing, which is really just a computer plugged into some servos, and it acts independently of the musician. And the second one is the oppositional agent paradigm, where the interesting interferences between your will and something resisting you are explored and exaggerated even. So it tries, and we've got all sorts of, the heart of this is machine learning, so it predicts what you're going to do and acts against it. And the third one is the excessively passive device, the device that's more passive than a violin, and it's more passive than a 1970s synthesizer, because it predicts what you're going to do, and it exaggerates, it anticipates and follows the musician. So in this sense, we can sort of, through performance, explore the experiences that go along with these paradigms for musical interactivity. And that's sort of it. So we'd like to thank the Arts Council England for giving us lots of money, which is useful, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to come here. And the other two collaborators, which are Patrick Wollner, who's in Austria now, finishing his PhD at Cambridge, and Dr. Alan Blackwell, who's our supervisor in the project. So thanks.
Guys, thank you so much. The Mephistophone. We're going to see this in performance anytime soon at a theatre in a couple of months?
Yeah, I think February will have
Fantastic. Looking forward to it. Either you've just joined us, so welcome, or you've been here all day.